Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network. Once again, and welcome to another edition of Inside Outer Limits radio show. And we hope that you're enjoying your day, night, wherever you are in the world, and everything's going well for you. And of course, once again today, I'm joined by my co-host, UFO royalty. I won't let him forget that. And that's Mr. Philip Mantle. How are you,
Good evening, Chris. I'm fine, thank you. It's nice and warm here in sunny Pontefract.
Yeah, very much the same here in Hull as well, Phil. You know, but thankfully it's not as warm as it was last week.
No.
So we can actually breathe. Oh dear. So Phil, anything you've been up to? Anything interesting going on in the world of ufology?
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things, and I think we're going to discuss something related to this evening with our guest from the other side of the pond, Peter Robbins. Good evening, Peter. Is there somewhere?
Are there, Peter?
Well, fine. We'll catch him in a minute. But one of the things I've been working on is the revised edition of Calvin Parker's book, Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter. Since the original manuscript came out, around about a year ago now, an awful lot has happened. We've had a number of independent eyewitnesses come forward, and thanks to our guest this evening, Peter, we found that both Calvin Parker and the late Charles Hickson, the other gentleman that was involved, at different times, different dates, different locations, were both put under regressive hypnosis by Peter's long-standing friend and colleague, Bud Hopkins. Again, yeah. Bud's sadly no longer with us. So I've been transcribing the hypnosis tapes of Charlie Hickson. He did 2 sessions with Bud, both some years apart, and they're both fascinating for different reasons. And then, last of all, I came across an unpublished article by the late arch skeptic Philip Klass, and it was about the Pascagoula case. It's only a short item, and someone said, he's got a file on this and it's stored at some facility. I can't remember the name of the place offhand, so I contacted them and they sent me the whole file. So I've finished that off, and what I did, I asked Calvin Parker, I said, did you ever meet Philip Klass? And he met him once only, and the story is Charlie Hickson was doing a TV show somewhere, and he wanted Calvin to participate, but he refused. But he said, I'll come and meet you and we'll have a catch-up and we'll have a chat. And Charlie says, there's another chap going on the TV with us. He called him a scientist. So Calvin was oblivious to who this was. So when he got to the TV studio, it ended up that the scientist, in inverted commas, wouldn't appear on the TV with Charlie Hickson. So neither of them ended up on it. And there was a journalist there, and he said, look, I'll take us all for dinner. So they all went across the street someplace. And Calvin was aware there was a bit of friction between Philip Klass and Charlie. And by the time they reached the restaurant, they weren't even talking to each other. And they were sat opposite Calvin. And the journalist said to Philip Klass, why wouldn't you appear on the television with Mr. Hickson? He says, I don't appear on television with liars and hoaxers. Now, Calvin heard this, And how can we say it politely? He lost his temper somewhat. And he told Mr. Philip Klass what he thought of him in no uncertain terms. And Calvin finished his piece off with this. He said, "We were asked to leave before we got our dinner." So he says, on the drive home, it was rather quiet and I was pretty hungry. But he said that was my one and only encounter with Philip Klass. And, you know, I met Philip Klass just once. I think it was 1996 at a conference in the States. And I had a chat with him, and he was, you know, easy enough to get on with, but he had a big badge on his lapel, Chris, and it was purple. I'll never forget, but it had in black letters abductee. So he's taking the mickey. And I said to him, "I can tell you're not an abductee." He says, "How?" I said, "You've got the wrong colour badge." And I just walked away and left him with that. You know what I mean? But when you look at Philip Klass's file on Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker, he wasn't trying to do any research, Chris. He was just trying to see if he could dig some dirt. That's all it was.
Debunk the man, not the information.
Because he also, in his file, he kept copies of the letters that he actually wrote to people, because this was in the day of the old typewritten stuff as well. And so you could see what he was asking them, as well as their replies or non-replies on a lot of occasions. And it all boiled down to, he called Charlie and Calvin hoaxers and liars, because Charlie had a polygraph exam right early on when all this happened, and the guy apparently wasn't totally qualified. He was a bit young for it. But I said to Calvin, I said, had he passed the polygraph, they would have said, well, polygraphs don't count. If you fail it, you're a liar. So it was in a no-win situation. And I asked Calvin, I said, if would you take a polygraph today? He said, yeah, if some damn fool's daft enough to go and pay for it, you know what I mean? So there we go.
I wonder if Peter is back there. Are you back yet, Peter?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hello, Peter.
Hi.
We did introduce you slightly earlier, but for some reason there was no response, so we're beginning to panic.
I'm sorry about that.
Like we were
Peter,
saying before we came on air, Peter, you've been in my thoughts of these last few weeks, because I've been transcribing the hypnosis tapes between the late Charlie Hickson and sadly the late Bud Hopkins. And, you know, I can't think of Bud without thinking about you. Because you were such close friends and colleagues for decades, I would say, overall, Peter. It's like when 9/11 happened, my thoughts straight away were for you and Bud. You know?
You are such a good and tried and true friend, Philip. As some people know, we met in 1997 when Left at East Gate had first came out, and you helped arrange a talk for us, and we've been in contact on and off ever since. I was fortunate enough to meet Bud a year or so into my obsession with this subject, which commenced in the mid-'70s. And in our 35-year-long friendship, about half of that time on and off, I worked with him on cases, doing everything from answering letters to intake, doing initial interviews with people, being a witness in more hypnotic regressions than I remember, and also my original career as a painter, being his studio assistant at times as well. I miss him terribly. It was wonderful, by the way, to meet Calvin in March for the first time. I was honored to count Charlie Hickson as a friend. I met him at the time when he came up from Mississippi to do those regressions with Bud. And not that long after that, I traveled down to Pascagoula to spend time with him, which was a double education for me, being a tried and true New Yorker who had never been that far down into the Deep South. And being with Charlie and going to locations and things, as you know, you both know as investigators, brings the thing to life in no uncertain terms.
Well, you're right. I mean, even today, Peter, you know, I try and speak with Calvin probably once a week. He thinks I've disappeared if I don't get him once a week, you know. But he tells me stories about, because he still loves to fish, and he'll tell me stories about when the alligator jumped on board his boat. You know, I didn't realise he got a boat. I just thought it was standing on the riverbank fishing, but no, it's on the boat. And then when the snake jumped on board the boat, he left that to his wife, you know.
That would do it.
Oh dear.
Because, you know, here, as you know, in this place, Peter, you've been in the UK many times. We have nothing like that. I think the most deadliest thing we have is it's probably a wasp. You know.
We have an adder.
True.
We have an adder, which is
Charlie,
can be poisonous to humans.
For me,
but it's it's not big. It's small.
Charlie, for me, epitomized essentially, in one sense, he's an American archetype, and for those of us that, you know, in the smaller parts of our mind, like to have fun at the expense of other folks, he is a Southerner, you know, tried and true. Probably, I'm guessing, not a university graduate.
No.
He is a man who has made his living with his hands, who, when I knew Charlie, Calvin was going through a very prolonged and not uncommon among abductees period of denial. I can't deal with it. It can't have happened to me. It's too much. It's got to be something else. I know in my heart it's real, but if I talk about it, I'm going to be a freak, and so on. And, you know, for the cavalier folks who have always had fun at the expense of people who make extraordinary claims that we know are true, but sound anything but to the uneducated, he's a perfect mark. At the same time, meeting him, and I don't use this word lightly, was actually quite humbling for me. I didn't know what he was going to say. I had yet to pick up the book. I thought the best way to do it was to buy it directly from him so that he would, you know, make the most money as opposed to buying it on Amazon or something, which is always good to support writers like that. His talk was by turns captivating, fascinating, chilling, funny, sad, inspiring. I didn't have anything to say at the end of it to the people sitting around me. I was just kind of in awe. And I know he was kind of on a barnstorming tour with the book. And I thought, how wonderful for him to have the experience of being out there in the world and meeting people he'd never meet otherwise. Those of us who have written and done book tours and gotten to travel in our research and investigation know what a treasure, what a gift it is. For me, the greatest perk on the job, the people that you meet and the places that you occasionally get to go that you might not go otherwise. I thought he was one of the finest, most credible UFO witnesses I have ever encountered. And then I read the book, which I thought, you guys...
Then you changed your mind.
Oh, I knew it was all nonsense. You know, Charlie's book is very much, here I am. I'm plodding away here. I'm writing my book with a colleague. And it's a fairly traditional way to approach the book. You did something I completely did not anticipate with Calvin. It is an account, in his own words, of what he remembered, the impact on his life, etc., but it is also one of those rare books in UFO publishing that is kind of a self-sustaining time capsule. It's filled with all of the archival material that, you know, those of us working a serious case sometimes spend years seeking out. The newspaper articles, the bits of memorabilia, ephemera, photographs, letters, notes. I would say if somebody wanted to approach the subject of UFO abduction and begin their education with it, a great place to start always is to pick up one of Bud Hopkins' classic books, Intruders, Missing Time. You can't go wrong with them. John Mack's Abduction. There's quite a lineup of them to leave many of them out. But if you're looking for a witness account to get you behind the eyes, into the heart of an individual who has lived, eat, breathed this, lie awake at night, I'm sure, prayed to God that it hadn't happened, knew it did, walked around holding the secret inside of him, and at a certain moment in his life, in part, prompted by somebody that we know who is a publisher in the UK saying, why not take a chance and do it? I'll help you make this public if you're ready. I'm just sorry that Charlie didn't live to see it, because he would have been very proud of Calvin. I am sure as I can be.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a great description of him there, Peter. I mean, like I say, every time I speak to him, I learn something new. And he has a wicked sense of humour. I mean, this little story is both funny and sad. He was going through such a bad time at one point. He contemplated suicide.
Yes.
And he phoned his insurance company up to see if he was insured for suicide, and they said, no, you're not.
Wow.
So he thought, well, I'll have to find some other way to die. So he had this bright idea of going into a cowboy bar, picking a fight with half a dozen cowboys. They beat the living daylights out of him. He staggered out of the door, disorientated. He says, I was such a dumbass, I staggered around and turned around and went back in by mistake, and I got another thumping. And he just laughs about it. He just laughs about it. He told me the story where his wife sent him for a loaf of bread, and he came back 2 weeks later. But all this...
he cracked me up,
it's unbelievable.
Too. After the talk, of course, there was a long line of people, and I was on it. I waited till the end. And I introduced myself. And when he got who I was in relationship to Bud and to Charlie and to him, we just started to talk. And that feeling of, here's a friend that I've had for years, but I just haven't met yet. Yeah. And all I can say is I look forward to the next time that we get together. Thank you for making that book a reality, and for giving him an opportunity to fully live his life rather than live being run by a certain amount of fear of ridicule. One of my favorite ufological topics.
Yeah. Well, somebody asked...
I'll just jump in. Sorry if I'll just jump in there. I know we actually interviewed him late last year, earlier this year, didn't we, Phil? And as you know, Peter, we plan our talks when we do this to be about 1 hour and 3/4, maybe 2 hours. But myself and Philip, I was that fascinated with him. I just sat back and listened, but we spoke to him. Was it something like 3 hours, Phil? 3.5 hours?
He's just like getting warmed up after
I was going to say, you can go that long and still... by every turn of what you say, continue to hold people's attention. I think all authors, all researchers, investigators, at their best, we are storytellers. And I use that word story very advisedly. The understanding is that these are true stories. When they are not, we have a problem, a big problem. But he is a great storyteller in the most traditional sense of the word. And in a very funny, poignant way, he reminded me of my late dad, who passed away this past November. My dad had a full, long, interesting life and lived to be pretty close to 100, and was compos mentis up until a day or two before he died here at home on his own terms. I bring it up because at the age of 95, my father said to me, matter-of-factly, I decided to write my memoirs. And my dad had a fairly dry sense of humor, and I thought, where's the punchline? And I followed him into the next room. I said, he said, you're a good writer. Your sister was a great writer. I have a story to tell. It's not quite that dramatic, but I'm going to do it. And I said, is there anything I can do to help? He said, yes. Next time you're in town, go to Staples and pick me up a pack of yellow legal pads. And over the next 2 years, he wrote his memoirs, and he did it longhand. He was a New York Jewish businessman whose most exciting adventure was being in the Army Air Corps and marrying my amazing mom and growing up poor but having a very interesting childhood in New York City. And like Charlie, absolutely no BS. You say what's going on, you move along, you relate the story, and even when you're talking about stuff that's fairly dry, it's interesting because you know how to relate it in a way without any affect, any spin. And it's funny to compare two such very different men and two such very different lives. But a good writer is a good writer, and a good storyteller. Where would we be without them in humanity? They are some of the most important people we have in our worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. Ree Calvin, when we spoke to him, to me, he just came over as very believable, but more importantly, a gentleman.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I'm English, but to me, he came across as a typical Southern gentleman. Maybe slightly old style, maybe a bit modern. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
But he came across as very, very, very believable, and I know in a little over 2.5 weeks' time, people at the OLM conference are absolutely going to enjoy listening.
Yeah, he also there's a special place in my heart for people that tend to dismantle stereotypes, and for a northern New Yorker, semi-intellectual urbanite like myself, even though I live deep in the American countryside these last years. It's easy. Southerners are an easy target, the same way that Northerners are to them. We're all subject to generalizations. But when you say gentleman, it reminds me of the derivation of words, a gentle man. He's not some hick yahoo, knock down the beer and let's go, shoot something. He's thoughtful. His sensitivity was extraordinarily apparent. I didn't get to chat much with his wife, but she was sitting off to the side, and I got to watch her reactions to his talk, and probably the 40th time she's heard a variation on it at least. You could see that this was a solid, loving relationship, that she was definitely proud of him. She was 110% on his side, and a mark of the quality of their relationship, having never been married, was let's do this together. Where somebody else would have been, hi, I'll be home in a few weeks, honey.
I do know from... Sorry, guys. I do know from talking with Phil earlier that, to some extent, it's Waynette, isn't it, Phil?
Yeah.
I think her name. I do know that Waynette... she really was the driving force in a lot of ways in getting Calvin to put his book out there, and Philip kind of came along at the same time as she was talking to him. The magic was created when all three of them really got together.
Well, what happened was they went to they went to an old friend's funeral, and Calvin hadn't seen him for a few years, and I don't know if it's a book of remembrance they were signing, but he signed it, Calvin Parker, and the people behind him saw his name, and it was sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and Calvin thought this was very disrespectful, and his wife says, well, you should write his story, and they don't have to point fingers, they can just go and buy it and read it, and he said, well, I'm not, I'm not a writer. And I think maybe a couple of weeks later, my email landed in his inbox, and he'd just been trying to put Waynette off. But once she saw the email as well, there was no escaping for the poor fella, And I hadn't contacted him about writing a book. I'd got the rights to republish Charlie's book, and I thought it would be nice just to maybe have an interview with Calvin and put it in the back. And he said, I've started on it. And, well, he'd done about 6 pages of notes, So I said, well, are you happy? And eventually, I don't think he'd any choice when he turned around and looked at Waynette, and that was it. And away we went. It's like you say, Peter, in the revised edition that I'm finishing off now, all of Calvin's stuff is finished. And he ends it with the fact that he now has closure. and that's where that's it. He can live his life now properly. And
Yes.
but he's a funny guy as well, because somebody, I don't know if it was at a conference or somewhere, said to him, Mr. Parker, would you have done anything different if you could have done? He says, yeah, I'd have stuck Charlie out in front and I'd have run.
Yes, a wise man.
Then he had to explain to them there was nowhere to run, otherwise they would have done it anyway. There was no escaping. I think the grass at the side of them was about 6 or 7 feet tall. It was full of debris. There was the old pier behind them, and then the river. So there was no. And then this thing was in front of them, so there was nowhere to run. But
not quite the wisdom of Solomon then, but
No,
certainly on that land.
I've heard Travis Walton address that moment where he, runs out under the craft from the vehicle in what one could only describe as a kind of macho, not fully thinking the thing through moment. Yeah. I've heard Steve Pierce, the youngest of the witnesses, say when they were young, he remembered watching Travis, while Travis was standing there when we were talking about this, chase a bear up a tree. And Travis gave me a look like, all right, so maybe it wasn't the smartest thing in the world. And just that moment of, maybe I shouldn't have done this.
Yeah.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah, well, but we mentioned, like I said, I found an old article. It was unpublished, actually, by the late arch skeptic Philip Klass. It's only about 3 pages long. It's typewritten, and it basically says he thinks it was a hoax. And then I found, via this, I found Philip Klass's whole file.
Yes.
And there wasn't a hint of research anywhere in it, Peter. He was just trying to dig.
He wasn't a researcher. He never, and he didn't confront witnesses in interview form directly when he felt intimidated by them.
Basically what you've got here is, and I'm sure he's done it 1,000 times, whereas he had no rational explanation for what happened to these two gentlemen, so he just called them liars and hoaxes, and that's it. Because he knows as well as we all do that sometimes when you throw mud, it sticks. But I'm sure, Peter, you must have encountered Philip Klass, and especially about what happened to you and your sister, surely.
Yeah. First, let me say, for anybody that's not aware, Philip Klass was an arch debunker, and let's get our terms straight here. Some people use it interchangeably with the term skeptic, and that is incorrect. A skeptic is just that. They are circumspect, cautious. They don't take people's words for things as much as they check them out on their own. For those of us in the field, and I would say the three of us qualify as people who have not been abducted by aliens, but have been involved in studies around the UFO phenomena, from the more mundane of, everything from radar returns and ground trace cases to contact cases to full-fledged being taken and returned phenomena, that we, at a certain point in our careers, I think you'll agree, we had been confronted by so much evidence, much of it that if such things were adjudicated in courts of law, could be presented as legal evidence, in the British or American legal systems, that at a certain point, we no longer had the luxury of disbelief. Can we agree on that point?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Once you hit that point, it is incumbent on you as a researcher, an investigator, a writer, however you want to see it, to reinforce your own skepticism and make sure that it is always there helping to guide you. And what I mean by that is it's a very healthy thing. It's an important research tool. If you are so hungry for the story, if you want so much to have that byline or to be the one that breaks this amazing case, and, I don't have to be quite so skeptical because I know the phenomena is true. This person has all the earmarks And, I can just skip that step and go right to it. You are not doing yourself or the work or the truth any favors. A debunker, on the other hand, and as you guys know, Bud, besides being a great intellect, a very courageous investigative writer, and God help the criminals of the world if he had gone into law enforcement, is all I can say. He was a brilliant detective, absolutely brilliant. We used to discuss this occasionally, and usually with a little bit of enjoyment, that skeptics are debunkers are an extraordinary group of people. They actually know empirically that the UFO phenomena is not real. It's all explainable in conventional terms. Now, that in itself is very impressive to me. I've been, feeling around in the dark for over 40 years trying to figure out what the heck is going on about something that they simply know is my poor deluded imagination, my desire to worship the X-Files poster I want to believe, to misinterpret things because I have this childlike wonder of the universe and want there to be aliens visiting us. They know that it's not real. And their job as debunkers, and Philip Klass being the king of debunkers for many years in America, was to help people to learn what piece of nonsensical pseudoscience or pathetic explanation, according to him, who had never really studied the subject, who had no background in investigation, who was an editor at a magazine called Aviation Week. And I guess because, it was Aviation Week, aviation, things in the air, flying around, gave him license to see himself as something of an expert on this. I first encountered Philip in 1987 personally. His reputation preceded him, and it was actually during a very important conference here in America, MUFON's 40th anniversary of Roswell, Kenneth Arnold, The Modern Age of UFO Sightings, again, 1987. First encountered Philip Klass personally in 1987. His reputation preceded him, but I was not surprised to see him at a very important UFO event, and one that was actually quite significant for me personally. In 1987, MUFON held their international symposium that year at American University in Washington, D.C. I thought it was very smart of them to associate that particular year's event with a respected institution of higher learning here in the States, because it marked the 40th anniversary of Roswell, the Kenneth Arnold event, and essentially the modern age of UFO sightings. It was particularly important to me because at that conference, one of our leading American researchers, the late, very great, and now recently departed Stanton T. Friedman, who was a role model, a true friend, a mentor, and a great guy, gave a paper that changed my life. It was called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. Menzel was the head of astronomy studies at the distinguished Harvard College here in America. And as a respected academic, certainly was somebody who, from the inception of UFO studies, but specifically into the 50s and very much in the 60s, was one of the leading people that the media would consult for his opinion on the matter of possible extraterrestrial intervention or the phenomena in general. And he was extremely skeptical to the point that he was a debunker. His secret life was that he was a deeply embedded member of the American national security community and had been for decades. And Stan, brilliant researcher that he was, not only was able to access his entire archive record at Harvard, with the permission of his wife, Menzel's widow. He also accessed his entire file in the National Archives in Washington and his papers at home, again, with the permission, obviously, of Menzel's widow. And what Stan was able to establish in a brilliant and breathtaking piece of research that he turned into a talk that was absolutely riveting was that this man lived a double life and essentially was in the employment of the American intelligence establishment. I should say also that Philip Klass's mentor was Donald K. Menzel. And I went, it was also within weeks of the whole MJ-12 story breaking. And I went home after that conference, determined to do a serious research paper, aspiring to the kind of thing that I had heard Friedman do. I had been in the field already a dozen years. I was working for Bud. I had had a few articles published. I had spoken at some conferences, pretty full of myself. But that set me off on research that I'm still involved in around the life and the circumstances surrounding the death of a great American, somebody whose story I hope to bring to the United Kingdom in the next year or so, because even though it's an innately American story, no Brit interested in the subject of UFOs will be less than fascinated by the life and death of James Vincent Forrestal, our first Secretary of Defense. And I will say here for the first time on the air that I have recently completed what amounts to a feature-length film, even though it's a very simple film, on the life and death of Forrestal, with two of my favorite colleagues, the great Jennifer Stein, who was executive producer on the Travis Walton documentary, and Bob Terrio, who was the filmmaker on that great documentary, which I'm hoping both of you have seen somewhere along the line.
I have, yes.
Okay, good. I'm hoping this autumn we will be airing that for the first time. Anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. Philip Klass attended that MUFON symposium. And, of course, everybody there knew who he was. And you could see he could be very charming, as sociopaths can be. He was having the time of his life, the absolute time of his life. And my only involvement, other than being an attendee, was Dr. David Jacobs had put together for the Saturday a panel discussion on the UFO abduction phenomena. It included a number of prominent abductees, and noteworthy is the fact that it included Whitley Strieber. And this was the year that his seminal book, Communion, was published. I was on the panel in my capacity as the assistant to a leading researcher in the field and the brother of an abductee. And Philip, lucky fellow that he was, managed to find a seat front row center and sat there smiling through the talk, occasionally taking pictures with his Kodak Instamatic flash camera, and increasingly irritating dear Whitley Strieber to a point where at a certain point he basically stood up and just started to yell at Philip, and I accuse you of this and that. Philip looked like the Buddha. He was beaming. It was maybe the happiest moment in his life. He had all the recognition in the world that he wanted. And afterwards, he approached me during a break. I could see him coming across the room. Body language was very submissive and respectful. Mr. Robbins, yes. I have to tell you, I was in so many words, I was very impressed and actually moved by your talk and, your reflections on your sister's experience. And you got me kind of wondering and things. And I had never heard everybody put it so articulately. And I wonder if I could do an interview with you later. And good old innocent me thinking for a moment, wow, I've impressed Philip Klass. Maybe I'm the one who could turn him around. Sure, I'll do that interview with you. And shortly thereafter, we did an interview in his or my hotel room, and that was that. I received a very respectful follow-up letter. Dear Mr. Robbins, thank you for the interview. When I finish the manuscript, I will send you what the term was, the blues. It is, in the old days of publishing, a A draft was printed double-spaced in blue for higher visibility, blah, 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 when you were making your notes in between the lines. And some months later, I received a brown envelope in the mail, opened it up, and it was a chapter, in fact, that I have here at hand, and it's titled "The Victims Speak," the word victims in quotations. And a good part of that chapter revolves around my interview and my sister's experience, which he ultimately dismisses as two young people who, well-meaning and certainly basically honest, but you know how kids are. They created this fantasy because they, quote-unquote, wanted to feel special. I remember thinking after reading it how much I wanted to make him feel special, but not perhaps in a way that he would enjoy. And his main argument was that even though I repeatedly expressed the fact, and it is a fact, that I had other things that interested me as a kid, and with the exception of the occasional Saturday afternoon wonderful, B science fiction movie at the Fantasy Movie Theater in town, I had no interest in the subject growing up, period. But he pointed out that a national magazine, when I was a kid, published a big article on the Betty and Barney Hill case after it broke in 1965. The fact that my family didn't subscribe to this magazine, that I was unaware of the Betty and Barney Hill case, well, that's a little detail that really didn't matter to him. And it's the same book, and it's not a bad one to have in your library if you can find it for like a nickel in a used bookstore, called UFO Abductions, A Dangerous Game. Well, that began my personal experience with him, and I wrote him with the help of an actor friend of mine. In fact, a Scottish Shakespearean-trained London School of Dramatic Arts actor who helped me write a brilliantly beautiful letter. We spent a little too much time on it, in fact, and I was so dismissive of Klass that I sent it to his attorney, thinking that would be even more insulting, and got a very nice letter back the next week that he thought it was a brilliantly well-written letter. But being that they had gone to press last week, it's a shame that he hadn't gotten the letter earlier. I chided myself on that one. Anyway, Philip is a really nasty piece of work. I did not like him at all personally. He went out of his way to destroy people who he could not prove were not telling the truth. He tried ever so long with Travis. Poor Steve Pierce, again, who was the youngest of the men on that crew, at a very vulnerable moment in his young life, he had become so freaked out about the attention and the ridicule that the guys, again, growing up in little snowflake Arizona, population 5,000, everybody knows everybody. These guys had been through the mill in the international media, and he had moved to Texas to get away from it. Phil chased him down and offered him $10,000 to change his story. Well, Steve's a good soul, and God knows he could have used that money. It would have been life-changing to him at the time. But Steve's an honorable man, and I'm sure with understandable human reservation, turned Philip down. Philip would occasionally come at Bud, and one of the things I learned from Bud, I knew it already, but Bud reinforced it with his very professional work ethic, was 95% of the time when people attack you in this field, especially when you're high visibility, ignore them. They are what I term ankle biters. And it's not even worth the effort to get engaged in them. It's just lowering yourself to their level. But every once in a while, in life, as in the field of ufology, you really aren't given a choice, and you need to address an attack. And when you do, you can never generalize. Everything has to be hyper, specific, and fully documented. It is infuriating because you'd have to take time out from your valuable time in your life to do it, but it's incumbent on you to do it, or people in certain cases will wonder why you didn't address that attack or that charge. Klass, again, made a living doing this, and it took Stanton Friedman again, and for me, one of the most important continuing presences in the field of abduction studies, the absolutely sensational Kathleen Martin, who is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, but certainly her work stands completely on its own. She is MUFON's head of abduction studies, has a long history of working with abductees, is one herself, although that was a strictly kept secret for many years, which she outed herself on some years ago. We're all very proud of her for that. They learned that Philip Klass's archive is held in Philadelphia. I'm trying to remember whether it's the American Theosophical Society or Philosophical Society, but it is accessible to scholars and people that can justify a desire or need to access this material. And they were actually, Kathy and Stan were actually working on, as I understand it, a book addressing Philip Klass's duplicities, lies, scandalous behavior, completely unethical behavior. I'll be seeing Kathy next month at the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO incident. The incident at Exeter, a very important mid-60s UFO event here in the States, and not very far from beautiful Exeter, New Hampshire, named after Exeter, England, as so many place names here are in the States, is where Kathy's uncle and aunt, Betty and Barney Hill, were taken as well. And I'm going to ask her about this because it is a book that needs to be written. This man was a really indecent human being. Anybody that tries to make their living destroying the lives of other people because they have a problem with true things that happen to them really is a person who should be understood. We also know now from research that they have done, and it's been corroborated by others, that Philip was not doing this completely on his own. He was a useful idiot, so to say, who was in the employment of the forces that be to do the work that he did. And I have, again, that quote from Mencken of, I have never killed a man, but I have approved of many obituaries that I have read. I remember learning when he passed away. I'm sorry for his family, but, well, what's on TV tonight?
I mean, you're right, Peter. I met him that once, and he was charming. He was really charming. You know, I only spoke to him for about an hour. You know, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but don't forget, Philip, that Brutus was Caesar's best friend.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean.
The court.
Yeah, I mean,
the pseudonym of the extraordinary woman who is the subject of Bud Hopkins' book Witness, the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO encounters, who remains a good friend of mine and who I saw just about 2 weeks ago at a retreat, her and I and other friends in the state of Rhode Island. She told me once, and she is another brilliant relater of great stories. She said Philip was always very charming with her and always wanted to spend time with her and get to know her better. And he lived in the Chesapeake Bay area of the States, not far from Washington, D.C., and apparently had a sailboat. And Linda had told me that he had invited her down to go sailing with him and his wife whenever she could or could get down to the area. And as she said, reflecting on it, you know, he always was so nice when he'd say it, but I thought maybe he wanted to drown me. So, you know, I never really...
Oh, dear. I was going to ask you, Peter. I was going to mention really. It seems that in his earlier years, Klass had an hypothesis that basically everything was plasma or ball lightning.
Yes.
You know, I'm quite surprised he didn't mention this to say that your encounter and your sister's encounter was something along those
Well,
lines. He tried to explain that for most of all the UFO cases that he kind of looked at, and even cases of alleged alien abduction. But what he did
was a theory.
Sorry,
That's okay.
Go ahead.
That was a theory that he basically inherited from Donald K. Menzel, Dr. Menzel. And as you said, that was something that he focused on earlier in his career. One of the most tragic and infuriating examples of Klass's behavior, although it was kind of on the footsteps of Menzel's, was helping to destroy, and I mean that literally, destroy the life of one of America's most respected, most credentialed, best credentialed, and for me, heroic investigators in the darker, earlier periods, and that is the late, great Dr. James Mcdonald, who is a brilliant atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona. If any of your listeners are interested in learning more about Dr. Mcdonald, and he is one of the most important presences in American ufology, and certainly one of the most scientific. There is a definitive biography that the great Anne Druffel wrote. Anne was a protege of his, and it's called Firestorm. It's in print. It's available from Amazon or wherever, and a book worth adding to your library. But Menzel and Klass kind of double-teamed him and helped to undermine his sanity, his trustworthiness with members of the American Congress, who he had testified before on the coming SST, what became the wonderful supersonic transport that ran between Paris, London, England for many years, and then because of a crash was retired. But he also testified on UFOs, and it was used to really help destroy his life, throw him into a terrible state of depression. He was not murdered, but he did kill himself. And, conspiracists will argue that, he was MK Ultra'd or, kind of brain scanned. No, he was just driven to terrible depression. His career was in shambles. His marriage was in shambles. And people that most Americans look to as authorities in rational explanation of UFOs, those being arch debunkers, Menzel and Klass, helped him helped to end his life. And that is a footnote that people should be aware of. The viciousness of attacks can throw credible witnesses into terrible depression. And I'm sure that's something that at certain points Calvin suffered from. I know Charlie did. We talked about it over the years. My sister was fortunate in that she had a good support system from the moment we first discussed this, something that I was unaware of for all the years, from when it had happened to her when she was 12 years old, her most pronounced one. She got involved with Bud early, was a member of his first support group and his first women's support group, had friends who took her seriously.
Well, what I was going to mention, I'll start now, sorry. 3, 2, 1. What I was actually going to mention was the fact that Klass goaded McDonald, didn't he, quite a lot, James McDonald, and I know they exchanged letters on the subject.
He did.
And, I find it quite interesting that Klass was using an hypothetical phenomena, plasmas, to explain another unverified phenomena, which is UFOs.
Yes.
I thought that it was quite...
It was brilliant.
Well, quite brilliant of him, really, to do that. But also the fact that Klass went over and wrote to McDonald's superiors at the US Navy. And although at the time, it is known that McDonald was retired by then, but he did do occasional work for the Office of Naval Research. But Klass questioned how McDonald could spend so much time on UFO research and still fulfil the requirements for an atmospheric research grant that he had. So so in one way he's pulling him like, look, you need to answer this, but the other he's got that knife ready, just like Brutus, to stab him in the back and and do away with it.
And in a very similar vein, many folks know that Stanton Friedman was a dual citizen of the United States and the great nation of Canada. He was born in New Jersey, fell in love with and married a lovely Canadian woman, a very strong marriage for decades. When Stan was in the process of doing his paperwork for residency to become a Canadian legal resident, which of course he was for the last decades of his life, Klass actually tried to interfere and let forces within, I don't know whether it's in the Passport Bureau or the State Department, know that, and the Canadian government specifically as well, that they might want to think twice about having this man live in their country because, he thought flying saucers were real and actually, talked about it, made money doing it. And how outrageous was that? Well, of course, they didn't listen to him. But he's I'd say weasel or pig, but it just insults sensitive, interesting social animals. Sometimes there aren't words to describe certain aspects of human behavior or human beings. I really detested the guy, and I think that the fact that you wanted to talk about him today, as you know, I thought was a terrific idea, and hope that folks will take it upon themselves to learn more about him. The fact is, as we know, the subject of truly anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity are paradigm-shifting, earth-shattering, and the most important reality that most human beings have yet to face. Stan, again, Friedman, who gave so much to the work, and sometimes because he was such a good debater and loved the English language so much and knew how to use it like a rapier. I walk around with certain quotes in my head, and one of them of Stan's was, the question is not, are all UFOs, I'm off by a few words, advanced technology under intelligent control from parts unknown coming and going with impunity? The question is, has one of them ever been? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. If there was only one true extraterrestrial, interdimensional, however you want to call it, genuine UFO event, it'd still be the biggest story for humanity, for many of us of all time. And I think one of the reasons, to go off on a pet tangent here, that world governments, first world governments overall, although Her Majesty's government, I think, has done us all a service over the years for that period of time that they declassified thousands of pages of UFO-related documents. Granted, no smoking guns, but a lot of interesting smoke. In America, though, that cover-up needs to stay in place because nationalism is a force that holds the world together for those that move the chess pieces and pull the strings. Imagine if we all, as President Reagan theorized in 1987 or so, if we all realized that there was, in his terms, a threat, or let's just say a presence out there that was non-human, absolutely intelligent, and coming and going from the earth for their own reasons, wouldn't we all maybe have a chance of beginning to think of ourselves first, not as whatever country we're from, whatever religion we practice, what our sex is, our socioeconomic role, the color of our skin, but as human beings? That could be devastating to nationalism as we know it, and they're not ready to relinquish that. One of the reasons I think that disclosure is not around the corner, no matter this new age of the last year and a half, 2 years, which is fascinating, of pathological respect for the subject of UFOs rather than pathological disrespect. That's good. But I'm waiting for the other shoe to fall.
I mean, you mentioned Stan Friedman there and Philip Klass. I mean, one of the things I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Peter, did Philip Klass not challenge Stan a couple of times with a monetary value at the end of it, saying you cannot find, I'm pretty sure it's to do with some documents of some kind. You can't find a document that, has X on it. I can't remember what the X was. And
Yes.
of course, Stan found them. Here's a picture of them, and there's a picture of the check that Mr. Klass had to send him as a result. Am I right there?
You are not only right, but it's the most joyous moment of this time between us so far on the air. You are right in spades. I have seen a Xerox of that check for $1,000.
That's right.
And a framed copy of which hung in Stan's office for his life, and a check that was most certainly cash. But yes, he put his money where his mouth was, and his mouth was a little too big. It wouldn't surprise me, though, if we were able to go back and accurately trace that fee was covered for him by folks that encouraged him to do the nefarious work that he did. But absolutely a mark of Stan's brilliance as an investigator and researcher, and a story that he never stopped enjoying relating to people that had not heard it.
Well, I just kind of thought it was a stupid challenge because knowing Stan's involvement in the archives of various establishments, he must have gone through more archives than anyone else that I'm aware of, Peter. So to challenge him on something like that, to me, was just plain and simply dumb.
Well, it was. And at the same time, Philip was not stupid. He knew how to market himself and how to take advantage of the genuine contributions to the field based on positioning himself as a writer. A perfect example, really, is I had mentioned that we had this exchange, the interview that was done in '87, but the book that covered it wasn't published for another 2 years in '89. And listen to this liner note from the back of that book. Are extraterrestrials abducting human beings and subjecting them to terrifying physical examinations? Have UFO nauts conducted bizarre genetic experiments by invading the bedrooms of teenage girls, to impregnate them and later returning to remove their unborn babies? Have alien beings kidnapped young children and remove flesh samples as part of an effort to crossbreed with the human race? If you have read Whitley Strieber's Communion or Bud Hopkins' Intruders, you owe it to yourself to read UFO Abductions. That's good marketing,
Okay, now,
and very slimy and sensationalistic as well, of course.
Yeah, I have that book.
what I'd like to do... Sorry,
No,
go
you're
ahead,
all right.
Phil, go on.
Well, I just wanted to mention one little thing, as a little an aside. Now, one of the things that's risen its ugly head again recently is the alien autopsy film hoax. Now,
Sure.
Stan Friedman met the Ray Santilli, the guy who promoted the film as being authentic.
Sure.
I think, in fact, I helped arrange his meeting with Santilli in London. Now, of course, Santilli had no idea who Stan was, or his credentials, or his background, or his experience.
No.
And Santilli told him the story that President Truman had gone out and seen all this. So Stan being Stan says, well, what was the date? So, of course, Santilli gave him a date, and within no time, Stan had checked at the Truman Library and found it was complete bunkum. That President Truman's movements for those particular dates were all accounted for.
Well tracked, you bet.
Yeah, and I thought you said that that's the wrong lie to the wrong man, It's as simple as that, And
God.
Yeah. Sorry, Chris, I interrupted you there. I just wanted to point that out.
No, it's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine, Philip. Not a problem. I wanted to move the conversation away from the arch debunker himself, the great Satan as he became, and I wanted to talk about your little announcement earlier on, Peter, regarding James Forrestal, and do you want to fill us out a little bit more? Tell us a little bit more about this, so who James Forrestal was, for those that don't know.
I'd be glad to. I was unfamiliar with his name, as is the case with probably 999 out of 1,000 contemporary Americans, until this Majestic 12 briefing document. And I think you guys know what I'm referring to here, many of your listeners as well. It's an 8-page report, a briefing document to then President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, passing along from this secret working group known as Majestic 12, MJ12, started under Truman, regarding what we knew to that point, basically, about this phenomena. Eyes only, copy one of one, etc., with a 1-page brief letter, dated, as I recall, September 24th, 1947, from Truman to the newly appointed first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, requesting that he move forward on this project and make it priority in so many words. Now, granted, MJ12 is a highly debated subject in ufology. And in fact, hundreds of pages of documentation alleging to be MJ12-related documents have come to public attention over the decades since this story broke open in 1987 and the initial 9 pages were made public. I am one of those people who did my own investigation, done extensive reading on the subject, networked with colleagues more knowledgeable than myself on it, top of which over the years has been Stanton Friedman. I don't know what to make of all of the materials that allege. My best sense is that a great deal of it, if not the overwhelming amount of it, may be disinformation. However, a good part of it is brilliantly constructed and almost as interesting as if it were real because of the tremendous detail, research, everything from nuances of idiosyncrasies of the alleged writers to the typewriter faces, etc. I am convinced, however, that initial briefing document is authentic and that letter attached is. With that understood, among the 12 individuals noted in that work group around Truman was James Forrestal, who had recently stepped down, retired as Secretary of Navy, and President Truman, who took office in April of 1945 on the death of President Roosevelt, had a radical idea at the end of World War II, which was the United States, the cabinet position had always been for the Secretary of War and something called the War Department. I always had, even as a kid growing up with an interest in American history, a begrudging respect for that verbiage. It was extremely honest. And what Truman wanted was, up until then, there was a Department of Army, there was a Department of Navy. In the Department of Navy, there was a subdivision for the Marines. And now we were having a new department within the defense establishment come on board in September of 1947, which was the Air Force. And in 1945, Truman requested that Forrestal, as a brilliant self-made American, a successful businessman who had become in the 1930s a member of an informal working group around the president that was alternately referred to as The dollar-a-year men, or Truman's kitchen cabinet, kind of a pun on a kitchen cabinet, and also as opposed to the official cabinet, the dollar-a-year men referred to the fact that these individuals, who were all very successful American businessmen, were asked to come to Washington at the request of the president and be available to be advisors to Roosevelt to help the United States get ourselves out of the Great Depression. They were paid for their services $1 per year. And at the end of their tenure, literally all of these guys went back to making a lot of money and being successful business guys. James Forrestal did not. I have to be careful here, because if I'm not, the rest of our time will go and then some. I got a bug in my bonnet about this guy in 1987, and I began to investigate his life. As you two know, I was primarily occupied over that period in the 80s and into the mid-90s with a prolonged investigation of the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, focused on the now very much disproven claims of my former co-author, Larry Warren. The Rendlesham Forest incidents, of course, are real, with certain exceptions, based on Warren's confabulations, inventions, exaggerations, and lies. Otherwise, though, I continued to return to my research on James Forrestal and gave my first talk on him in 2004. Put it away. Came back again a few years later, studied more, read more, added more to it. In 2004, the long suppressed, classified investigation into the circumstances surrounding his so-called suicide became public, and that was more fodder for the mill. I then did another series of talks between 2012, 2015, put it away again. About 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was in a quandary. I realized I could spend the rest of my professional life in ufology continuing to do what we do: research, investigation, presentations, publishing. But with rare exceptions, for me, an exception comes up in a few days at a library about 2 or so hours drive from here, in another rural part of New York State, where I'll be giving a talk. I like giving talks at libraries because you often are speaking to, much more often than not, uninitiated audiences, people who are not, quote unquote, into this subject necessarily. They may have a basic curiosity. They may be coming because it's a free talk and you get to have a little fun. Here's somebody who believes flying saucers are real. I'll bet they're packed in aluminum foil under their clothing. Ha, ha, ha. But I began to really ponder, how can I find a way to reach another audience? A broader audience, a different audience, an audience of people that overall are well-educated, might take the subject seriously if it was presented in just the right manner. And I really labored over it for some time. As you guys know, I think, I have a background in theater, as well as the visual arts. I graduated from the finest art school in America. I taught painting there for many years. But I grew up very fortunate kid, loving the theater, having grandparents in New York City who took me to children's theater, and then when I was still a kid, to Broadway plays and musicals. I was one of those kids in high school who was in my school plays and things. When I got to university, I really had to consider whether or not I wanted to go into visual arts or theater arts, and decided on visual arts, set my sails on being a painter. But one of the greatest experiences of my life was for about half a dozen years working as a house manager, the house manager or theater manager, for what was at the time one of New York City's greatest standing repertory companies, called the Mirror Repertory Company. The name of our company based on that wonderful Shakespeare quote, "To hold as 'twere a mirror." And we were dedicated to staging revivals of important plays with almost no chance of commercial success. We were a nonprofit company and endowed by many wonderful actors and foundations and folks with the means to help us bring great culture to our audiences. And I loved working with live actors. I worked with Tony Award winners, with Academy Award winners. They were some of the most wonderful people I've ever met, some of the greatest artists, and incredibly inspiring. You go out there every night and you make it happen. It's not like being in a closed set, having to memorize a page at a time, and in rotating repertory, you sometimes have to carry around 2 or 3 parts in your head because we're doing that many plays at the same time, rotating them. It's almost beyond belief. I bring this up because I thought maybe there was a way I could use some of my experience in the theater to bring this subject to a different kind of audience. Now, I've studied acting for decades, but I'm not an actor. I've studied acting because I had the great privilege of having as one of my dearest friends a man named John Strasberg. John's a brilliant director, and for my money, the greatest acting coach working in America today. His father arguably was the most influential acting coach of the 20th century, Lee Strasberg, who numbered among his students Marilyn Monroe, Paul Newman, Eli Wallach, Ann Jackson, Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, on down the great American pantheon. And I thought maybe there's a way that I can take some story in ufology and convert it not into a play. I'm not a playwright, not that I'm adverse to working with a playwright on a play about the right aspect of this. We've had, of course, countless films dealing with the UFO theme, some of them brilliant, some of them god-awful, many of them simply mediocre and forgettable, but bloody little in the way of real theater, legitimate theater on the subject. There are a few exceptions. I've read quite a number of plays. Most of them are well-meaning, but not very effective. Anyway, I knew I didn't want to write a play, but I'm a good reader, and I certainly know how to hold my own in front of an audience. And I thought maybe I could do a dramatic reading. And rather than like a lecture where you're focused on advancing your images, with your remote clicker, or in the old days, the slides, Kodak projectors, that I could work with a dedicated assistant and ever so many images that would come and go to help tell the story on a screen behind me that might even suggest sort of a stream of consciousness. And I thought, what's the story? What's the best story I know in ufology that has a natural dramatic arc that reads at times like a great novel and ends literally like a Greek tragedy, that I could tell without augmenting anything, without spinning or exaggerating anything. And even though there are teasing things like, yes, Truman may have been in Roswell, New Mexico for a day or two on a highly secured trip in July of 1947, may have happened. But there's nothing to absolutely confirm it, and I can't use it. That's where I draw the line. And I thought, the story of the life and death of James Forrestal. And what I did was I took my working notes that I would use when I gave presentations on Forrestal. I augmented them with more factual material, and then I completely rewrote them so that in my mind they might mimic how I would tell the story in my own words if I was brilliant enough to carry every detail of information in my head, not try to hide the fact that I was working from a script that I had half memorized, but talking directly to an audience and having those images fly behind me. Anyway, I workshopped it for the first time with a small group of friends and their friends at another friend's apartment on the Upper West Side of New York about 1.5 years ago. Of course, the projector failed immediately, and I had to wing it. But I gave a talk about James Forrestal that I had dramatized, that I wasn't holding back using my voice to make certain points that I might be more analytical about at a UFO conference. And, it was partially successful. About 6 months later, I did it more formally for a terrific regional UFO group, a meetup group here in the States, not that far from me, in Rochester, New York, where Richard Dolan lives, good friend and close colleague. That worked better, and I had a dedicated assistant to help me out. And then most recently, in April, I was scheduled to do it yet one more time, more polished, for another terrific regional working group called Mainline MUFON, just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My aforementioned Jennifer Stein, who a close colleague and who runs that group, said, "Great, let's do it. I will be your dedicated assistant." And we had scheduled for a certain evening. I came in the day before. I had an interview scheduled the next morning with a local television show. We get back to Jen's house late that afternoon, and she says, I have a small studio down in the basement. I said, I know. She said, I have a green screen. I said, yeah, that's great. She said, and Bob Terrio's coming over with his camera. Great. She said, how would you like to do this with a teleprompter? And I thought, whoa, I have never used a teleprompter in my life. We all know what they are. They've been around for decades. And I wasn't completely confident because I'd never used one. I'm much more confident holding papers in my hand. The speed of a teleprompter has to be reset. But I thought, I'm game. Let's do it. And we did it in one long take with a number of slight corrections for time. Well, Jennifer and Bob said, if you're up for it, let us take this and work with it in the studio and take all the images you've collected, add more images, and add actual film footage. And I thought, wait, this is going way beyond my budget. And Jennifer said, if you allow me, I'll be the executive producer on it. I'll pick up the fees, and we will make this into a feature-length presentation. And I thought, I trust these people implicitly. We've worked together on quite a number of projects over the years. They're both dear friends. They absolutely have the story. And what they achieved, I have to tell you guys and your audience, left me really knocked back in my chair. Bob is a master in the studio and integrated this material, but then did all the overlaps and all the fades. Every image that we use, we properly licensed. We found some incredibly moving pieces of film footage of Forest Hall, deployed them, I think, in the most effective way as possible. And it comes in at about an hour and a half. And it is simply me looking in your eyes, talking to you, giving you the life of this man. And occasionally I'm not there and you're just focusing on images, but it is photographs, headlines, letters, drawings, cutaways to newspaper articles, newspaper headlines, war news, on and on and on. And then the life of this man who began his life as an Irish American, growing up in a very small town in upstate New York, going to a good university, transferring to a better university, deciding during World War I he wanted to get in the action, joined the Navy, was allowed to transfer to a unit in Canada that was training American pilots to fight in the RAF. The war precluded his service, returned home, made quite a success of himself, and a Wall Street broker. Seemed to be in a storybook marriage that really was a very troubled marriage. But at his height in the Roaring 20s, he was Kennedy-esque. He was the guy, as they say, that all the women wanted to sleep with and all the guys wanted to have a drink with. Incredibly handsome, a ferocious competitor, professional level golfer and tennis player, a passionate amateur boxer, a poignant detail of his life is that about 1913, while at university, in an amateur boxing ring, he got his nose broken, and he made a direct decision not to have it fixed because he thought going through the rest of his life with a broken nose would make him look tougher. And it did. It did. But he was a scholar. He was a student of Greek philosophy and poetry. He was extremely well read. And again, as America went into the Great Crash and the Depression, he was one of the few leaders on Wall Street that managed to hold his brokerage together. So much so that by the mid-30s, as America was beginning to edge its way out of the worst part of the Depression, a colleague of his who was an eminently connected banker and a good close colleague of Franklin Roosevelt brought Forrest All to Roosevelt's attention. And he was invited to come to Washington and become one of these $1-a-year men. But he was a true patriot, a word that in both of our countries, let's face it, is bandied about by people who have no right to use it, and in fact are anything but very often. He was the real deal, and he never left Washington. He stayed there and worked in government for the rest of his life.
Now, talking about, the rest of his life.
To not tell the whole story, but to just get into where it intersects with our mutual interest here. As I tell the story,
Sorry, Peter. I was just going to say he rose up the ranks, as it were, in Washington, and as you've mentioned earlier, he was the first Secretary of Defense. But I believe that him and Truman, President Truman, didn't really see eye to eye on a few things, and that led to his demise in that position in so many words. And I think the elections were coming up, weren't they, in 47, 48, something like that. And I think did he hear that he was going to be replaced or something?
All that is true, but it was yet years to come.
Okay.
Basically, he went from being a great financial advisor of Truman's to becoming Deputy Secretary of the Navy. In our pre-war Navy. Imagine being in charge of procurement of every single physical item for Her Majesty's Navy, from steel to make ships to, the caps that sailors wear on their heads, and handled it brilliantly. He was the kind of guy who thrived in high-stress situations, and that's important to know about him because when he cracked, the factors that were involved in his breakdown were profound. And one of them was the fact that he knew everything there was to know. Everything there was to know about the UFO situation, because his job description was that in terms of defense, he knew everything that the president knew. He could even make policy. He went from being Deputy Secretary of the Navy to Secretary of the Navy. And unlike many bureaucrats and cabinet secretaries who would never put themselves in harm's way, he repeatedly did. He was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Tokyo Bay. It went on and on. He had distinguished himself to such a degree at the end of the war that, again, catch up where we were, Truman asked him to oversee the dismantling of the old War Department and the creation of something that still exists, our national security establishment here in the States called the Defense Department. He was very appropriately nominated as the first Secretary of Defense and was sworn in extremely suddenly, I believe on September 18th or so, for reasons that we then learned had to do with a crash in New Mexico. He was sworn in 9 weeks or so after Roswell. It all settled on his shoulders. When you study the life of this great man, and for anybody interested, there is a definitive biography on him called Driven Patriot by two great American historians, Douglas Brinkley and Townsend Hoops, Hoopes, I think, which will always stand as the definitive biography. He had a terrible personal idiosyncrasy of pathologically personalizing all of his professional successes and failures. If he had a professional success, it was probably an even more heady experience for him than it was for the next guy over. But he could not disavow himself. He could not disconnect. He could not keep out of the way of what he perceived were his failures. And for him, as the head of the most powerful military institution ever created that we know of, let's say, maybe there were other ones 10, 40,000 years ago that were more powerful, who knows. Earth continues to evolve. But with that power, nothing that he did was able to advance our collective knowledge of this possible threat and certainly mysterious intervention of our skies, and it tore him up. It tore him up. I'm not going to obviously tell the whole story, but basically in making the presentation, I'm somewhat, how can I say, devious in that the term, no reference comes up to anything relative to UFOs. Of course, that term didn't exist then. It came into existence about 1955, 56, until we're more than halfway through the story, which is the way you do it chronologically. And then we really zero in, and I superimpose on the timeline of his tenure as Secretary of Defense, developments, documents, major stories within the UFO world. And then we do come to that time where we're coming into the presidential election of 1948, remembering that Truman had not been elected president. He had inherited the role, like President Johnson did after the demise of the previous president. And Truman wanted to be elected president, and it looked very bad for him. The then governor of New York State, a man named Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican candidate, was leading the pack. And now, in modern American politics, it is de rigueur. No presidential support team would even consider not having something in place, some contacts with the competitor's team, because of the possibility of transfer of power. Somebody or some individuals, quietly get together and make contact. However, 1948, that was not the way it was done. And it was actually a mark of, almost a visionary, far-seeing mark of Forrestal, who was nothing if not a keen political observer and an extremely loyal member of his party. But more to the point, a loyal member of the American government, who suggested to a colleague that perhaps somebody within Truman's inner circle should make contact with somebody within Dewey's inner circle, just on the possibility, and unfortunately it looked good, that there might be a transfer of power. There were men around Truman who had developed a deeper and deeper, not disrespect, not dislike even, jealousy of Forrestal, who truly was a golden boy within Truman's reality. He never failed him. He literally helped the United States of America have the victory that contributed to us all not speaking German now, to be blunt. And it was brought to Truman's attention in the most distorted, unfortunate, disloyal kind of spin to it. And sadly, Truman bought it. And it had to break Forrestal's heart. I don't know if there was ever a more loyal man in government in the 20th century than James Vincent Forrestal to two American presidents. I am sure, I don't say this as a figure of speech because this is the kind of man he was, he would have rather died than betrayed either of these great American presidents. Anyway, all cabinet members, maybe it's the same in the UK, I don't know, when a new PM comes in, there is a pro forma submission of your resignations. And if you want to stay in office, you hope that your resignation is not accepted. His was. They met several times. He left office with a huge change of command ceremony at the Pentagon. We include film footage of it in the Forrestal film that Jennifer and I and Bob have just completed. And Forrestal, up until then, his behavior had been certainly somewhat stiff, but absolutely, no indication in his public demeanor or appearances or involvement with anybody that he was increasingly crashing inside and about to have a profound nervous breakdown. It literally happened right there during the change of command ceremony. The details are heartbreaking, fascinating, and incredibly well documented, all covered in this film. And we very quickly see him attempt to take his life. And without going into a spoiler, so to say, let me just make this point. As we sit here, I would bet hard cash that among the three of us and everybody listening to us, there is no one who has not themselves been in or consulted with or knows somebody who has been, what we'll say euphemistically, in therapy, or consulted a therapist, or a counselor, or a psychologist, or a psychiatrist at one point or another in their lives. It's just part of the way modern culture is. In 1949, I think I can also say very safely, unless you were, say, a society matron and had decided to go to Vienna to be analyzed by a protege of Dr. Freud's, nobody in America or Great Britain knew anybody who saw a psychiatrist or was in therapy or was, undergoing regression for a childhood trauma or. Forrestal was the ultimate, almost caricature of an alpha male. And I don't mean that in terms of, going around and killing a lot of animals or beating people up. I mean, he was a scholar and a gentleman, but ferociously competitive and as sharp and as keen a mind as we have, who powerful men respected. I think the prevailing wisdom, and it took me years to make my peace with it, but I think this is the way it was, is the men around Truman knowing, even though they didn't know the particulars, they were at least briefed to know something about the reality of the UFO phenomena and its implications for humanity. Here was a man who knew everything that the president knew, who had literally crashed and burned and had a nervous breakdown. Nervous breakdowns are for girls. Alpha males don't have them. And let's say he was treated for it and was quote unquote cured. Maybe he might have a relapse in the future. And if he did, he could blurt out everything or anything. Allegorically, he knew where everybody was buried. I don't say this for the sake of drama, but for the sake of fact. From the moment James Forrestal had his visually apparent, incredibly heartbreaking public nervous breakdown, he had to die. I use a very dark aphorism, dark humor, sometimes the only humor we have, that I would ascribe to a mafia hitman before shooting in the back of the head twice with the silenced .22 pistol. It's nothing personal. It's just business. Forrestal knew it. And in those few days before he was institutionalized at Bethesda Hospital, he did try to kill himself at least twice. We have it on record. He knew it had to happen. But then he started to respond to treatment. And then they had to finish the form.
Peter,
Anyway.
I just need to interrupt there. We've literally got 2 or 3 minutes left. So I was just going to ask, do you have a release date for this?
We don't. And right now, it may be sometime this autumn. My feeling is, I agree with Jennifer and Bob on this. It should not be just blasted out in public. There should be screenings, and I hope to bring it personally to the UK and screen it there, ideally sometime next year for the first time. But until then, I think we're going to be fairly circumspect with it. It's not time sensitive, obviously, but in the bigger picture, I think it has a chance of bringing more people who care less about UFOs into the sphere of a terribly dramatic and really well documented story. When people see the dozens of actual sources that are listed in the notes, there's nothing specious, there's nothing grabbed from the internet, there's no conspiracy theories in here. This is scholarship that I'm proud of, that I've been working on for years, if not decades, and finally put in a form that I think will be a good tool for all of us to breach the subject with folks who are not interested in it, but will be taken aback by a timeless story of a decent individual caught in a terrible situation.
Well, I can say it's certainly something I'm actually looking forward to seeing come out into the public domain, basically. Yes. I quite enjoyed that. So I'd just like to thank you again, Peter, for your time in joining us again today. And I'm sure Philip would like to make a comment too.
Absolutely fascinating, Peter. I could have sat here all night and just listened to you.
Do you know, I was exactly the same, Phil, to be honest.
I mean, I'd heard of Forrestal and I knew a brief smidgen of information about him, but that is all. And I think you're spot on, Peter. I really do.
Well, I'm hopeful that this will be one of those stories that can jump upon nicely. And just because it involves an American in American government, in no way will that hamper any interested listener in the United Kingdom. And guys, I wanted to thank you. Number one, we are friends that go back sometime. You and I, Philip, Chris and I have become friends through the miracle of electronic communication. I think of you guys as brothers in this work. I will always wish you both well. I look forward to our next time on air, and even more so the next time we get to see each other, which I hope will be sooner than later.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, completely agree. Thank you very much again, Peter. Thank you.